What would you do if you found a perfect row of pecan shells in the woods? In Honobia, Oklahoma, there's a story few dare to tell, a story where the forest watches and remembers who betrayed it. Wyatt Boone, a former wildfire fighter haunted by guilt, follows the signs deep into the mountains, only to find a dying girl in an abandoned homestead and a secret her father died to protect. Letters from the past speak of forest keepers, silent neighbors, older than memory, who once saved a man from fire and vanished into mist. This isn't just another Bigfoot tale. Based on real fire reports and tribal legends from 1994, this is about legacy, forgiveness, and what happens when humans stop trying to own the woods and start trying to deserve them. You'll witness a story of quiet redemption, where a wounded man risks everything to save a creature no one dared name. And in return, the forest speaks back, not with words, but with signs. A cracked pecan shell, a river mussel, a braided strip of hide. If you skip this video, you'll go on thinking the forest is just trees. But the truth is, sacred things still walk these woods. They're watching, waiting, hoping we're finally worth being neighbors. And hey, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments so I can say hi to you properly. We've got a story to share. Just before dawn, the wind had gone quiet. What was left behind wasn't silence. It was a kind of stillness that pressed in from all sides, as if the land itself were holding its breath. Wyatt Boone stepped out onto the warped wooden porch of the farmhouse barefoot, holding his weight off the bad knee. He didn't need to check the time. He could feel it in the air. The change. The way the trees didn't rustle. The way even the barn cat refused to stir. It was the kind of morning that warned you softly, before anything broke. The gravel crunched low under his boots as he made his way to the northern fence line. A white tail rabbit darted from under the woodpile and vanished into the brush. Wyatt stopped walking. A strange sound, it wasn't loud, but it didn't belong, came from the pasture. Not animal, not weather. Something old wood makes when it can't hold up anymore. He rounded the path and saw it. Fence posts snapped like bones, wire curled and slack in the dirt. But that wasn't the strange part. On top of each splintered post, perfectly balanced, were pecan shells. Empty, clean, and placed in a straight line, like a trail left for someone who knew how to read it. Wyatt didn't speak. He just stood there with the gray morning crawling up his back, remembering the way it felt years ago in Montana when a fire jumped 2 ridge lines and turned toward the smoke jumpers who hadn't seen it coming. That same sensation now. Something too large to understand, moving just out of sight. He crouched low beside the nearest post, running a calloused thumb along the inside of a hollowed pecan shell. No bite marks, no claw marks, just clean. Almost like it had been opened by hands. He didn't say it aloud, but his thoughts formed a shape anyway. This was not the wind. This was something else. There were footprints in the soft dirt, too large for any man, too straight to be bare. The stride was wrong. Long, deliberate, almost methodical, like something was walking with purpose. He adjusted the brim of his cap, his breath curling pale into the air, and followed. The forest was damp and hung with the scent of cedar and rot. A slow creak muttered down through the rocks on his left as he made his way deeper, the trail getting narrow, softer underfoot. And every so often, every bend, every moss-covered stone, there was another pecan shell, balanced, waiting, almost like an invitation. He didn't realize where he'd arrived until the trees opened just enough for him to see the old sign, crooked and half-buried in ivy. Bellamy Homestead, 1938. The letters were faded but carved deep. Wyatt hadn't seen that name in decades. Not since Graham Bellamy disappeared and left behind more rumors than facts. The house was nothing more than bones now. Sagging beams, shattered windows, and the roof collapsed on one side. But something about the place refused to fall completely. He circled wide around the back, toward where the old root cellar should have been, the wind turning warmer the deeper he went. The door to the cellar hung by a single hinge, scraping soft against the concrete as he opened it. And down in the pit, barely visible in the shadows, was a body, thin, still, arms curled in. Wyatt didn't hesitate. He climbed down, his boots sliding on the damp earth, and dropped to his knees beside her. A young woman, maybe early 20s. Skin dry, breathing shallow. He lifted her carefully. She was light, too light. Her hair stuck to her face with sweat, and her lips were cracked from thirst. He carried her up into the light. The trail back wasn't easy. His knee screamed with every incline, but he didn't stop. Halfway through, he heard a crack in the trees behind him. Not close, but not far either. A pause, a presence, something watching. He turned his head just enough to see it. A tall shape, still as the tree beside it. Shoulders like the width of a doorway. No movement. Just there. Watching. Then it vanished behind the moss and pine like it had never been. By the time he reached the edge of the forestry road, his breath was shallow and the girl's pulse was fading. He knelt, trying the CB strapped to the old fence post he'd set up years ago to catch radio static from the local service routes. Boone to anyone. Got a girl, breathing shallow, need evac. The static danced, then came a voice like gravel and cigarettes. Boone, that you? Leland here. What girl? Bellamy. Think she's a Bellamy. There was a long pause. I'll come. Leland Thatch arrived 10 minutes later, driving that faded green postal truck with the cracked windshield and the back half rusted through. He looked older than Wyatt remembered. His hair gone fully white under the cap, but his hands were steady as he helped lift the girl into the passenger seat. Where'd you find her? He asked, glancing once toward the trees. Cellar, old Bellamy place. Leland didn't respond. He just looked again, long and quiet, then reached for the thermos in his lap and passed it back to Wyatt. She say anything? Not yet. But just before the truck rattled to life, the girl stirred. Her lips moved, barely more than a whisper. Haven. Wyatt leaned closer. What? Her eyes fluttered, unfocused. Then she went still again. Leland turned the truck and drove toward town, wheels kicking up gravel behind them. Wyatt didn't follow. He stood there a moment longer, staring back into the trees, trying to understand what he'd seen. Something caught the light near the steps of the homestead. He walked over. A piece of leather, old, hand-stitched. A thin strip of rawhide folded into a loop, with a knot tied at the center in a pattern he didn't recognize. It hadn't been there before. It wasn't dropped. It had been placed. He picked it up. The leather was warm. Not from the sun, from something else. Later that afternoon, standing in the hallway of the small hospital clinic, Wyatt leaned against the doorframe of Maris Bellamy's room. She was sleeping now. An IV drip in her arm, color beginning to return to her skin. Iris Crowell, the young forestry intern assigned to this district for the fall, walked up beside him. Her hair still smelled faintly of pine smoke from her morning patrol, and she wore that tired, curious look of someone who hadn't yet been taught what not to ask. You carried her all the way out? Wyatt nodded. And how'd you find her? That deep? He turned slightly, meeting her eyes. Then he looked to the far window, where the sun had just started dipping behind the ridge. In the glass, there was a reflection, a tall shadow outside. Just for a second. I didn't, he said softly. Someone else did. When she asked what he meant, he didn't answer. Just reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the leather strip with a strange knot, and turned it over in his fingers. Iris stared at it for a long time. Where'd that come from? She whispered. But Wyatt had already stepped away from the door. Out in the hallway, the nurse at the front desk adjusted the radio dial. Static. A country ballad faded in and out. A dog barked outside, and someone's truck rattled past the window. In the room behind them, Maris turned her head slowly on the pillow. Her hand twitched against the sheet. And down the long corridor, something passed the window again. Quiet, watchful, moving with purpose, but never rushing. Wyatt Boone, who hadn't believed in ghosts or God or anything that didn't burn or bleed, stood there a moment longer with the weight of the knot still in his hand, and a question growing louder in his chest. What else had been watching him all these years? The sun set behind the trees, and in the distance, a crow called once. Then silence again. Not absence, but presence. Something still there, something waiting. And under the porch at the old Boone place, long after the lights had gone out, a single pecan shell lay upright on the step, waiting. The mornings had turned sharper, air like glass, crisp against the skin, whispering that summer was leaving for good this time. Out on Boone's porch, the boards still creaked the same way they did every morning, but the sky above them had shifted, bluer but colder, and the trees beyond the pasture were just starting to turn. The shadows ran longer. The silences sat heavier. Wyatt stood there with his coffee going cold in his hand, staring toward the north fence again, as if it might tell him what he still didn't understand. The girl was still resting at the clinic. Her name was Maris Bellamy, and that alone had stirred up enough old dust to cloud the air for miles. That name hadn't been spoken much in Honobia since Graham vanished. But now here she was, thin, worn, with skin like parchment and a voice barely louder than breath. And she wanted to go back. Not to leave town, to go back to the homestead. He didn't ask why. Some kinds of grief don't need questions. You just nod and make sure the tires are aired and the truck has enough oil. He picked her up from the clinic 2 days later. Iris Crowell already sitting in the back with her backpack, scribbling notes on her forestry maps. The girl was dressed in second-hand denim and a borrowed coat from the nurse's closet. She didn't speak much, but the way her hand kept finding that rawhide knot in her pocket told him something was pulling her back harder than she let on. The homestead looked worse in daylight. The roof had sagged deeper, like it had exhaled for the last time and given in. Squirrels darted through the eaves, and a buzzard took off from the chimney when the truck rumbled up the path. Maris stepped out slowly, her boots crunching on the gravel, her breath visible even in the early morning. She didn't look scared. She looked ready, as if she'd been waiting for this silence to greet her. They walked inside together. The floor groaned under every step. The kitchen was barely holding, mildew crawling up the cabinets, light filtering through holes in the roof like spotlights on ruins. Wyatt reached for the crowbar strapped behind his seat and started clearing out old debris around the stove. It was just a rusted old iron box now, sunken slightly from decades of heat warping the boards beneath it. He pulled at a metal tin jammed under the lip of the oven. It didn't budge. Then the board beneath him gave a crack. He dropped low fast, his knee nearly folding. He caught himself on the edge of the counter, but what stopped him wasn't balance. It was the faint sparkle in the beam of light cutting through the ceiling, just above a line of gravel laid thin across the floor. A small arrow, barely there, but placed. Not random. Deliberate. Like someone had known this spot would rot first. He braced on that line and shifted his weight, prying the tin loose just as another section of floor gave way behind him. Dust rose. Maris coughed once, hand over her face. He climbed back, holding the tin in his hands. It was a cookie tin, the kind that used to hold sewing kits in every grandmother's house. The outside was scraped to hell, but the lid still held. He popped it loose. Inside were letters, wax-sealed and folded with precision. The kind of careful that only comes with intention. And old grief. They sat on the porch to read them. The light filtered through the bare trees now, cool and soft. Wyatt handed the first one to her. Her hands trembled just slightly. Inside, in thick faded ink, Graham Bellamy had written about something that had saved his life. Not a man, not an animal. A shadow that pulled him from the wreckage of a fire in '46. Something big, gentle, wordless, and he'd written about the promise he made to protect the land because of it. A debt he never stopped carrying. Iris flipped the pages gently, studying the signature, then the seal on the envelope. Her brows furrowed. The wax wasn't Bellamy's. It held a different mark. A symbol, circular, with what looked like twisted branches forming a spiral. Her eyes widened as she leaned in. She pulled out her notebook and traced something beside it. "This symbol," she said quietly. "I've seen it out near the lumber boundaries, etched into old trees, but it doesn't match any tribal sign, not forestry, not local surveys." She looked up at Wyatt. "You ever heard of Buckland Reese?" Wyatt's face didn't move, but his jaw set tight. "Yeah, he's the one that buys scrap out by the old quarry. Doesn't come to town much." "That's his seal." The air went cold again, not with wind, with something else. They didn't see him coming. Buckland was just there, standing at the bottom of the porch steps, his boots half sunk in leaf rot, his long coat stained at the hem, eyes like steel, sharp and dry. He didn't smile. He didn't ask. He just pointed his chin toward the door behind them. "What are you doing in that house?" Maris stood, clutching the letters to her chest. "It's my father's," she said. "He lived here." Buckland stepped up one stair. "Don't mean it's safe." Wyatt moved between them. "We're not disturbing anything." Buckland didn't blink. "Some things want to stay buried. Let 'em." Then he turned and walked back into the woods like he was never there. No sound, no scent, just gone. They didn't speak for a while after that. Wyatt helped Maris gather the rest of the papers. They stored them in a canvas bag, made notes of which beams were still sturdy, which parts of the house might hold through the winter. Iris paced around the perimeter, scribbling field notes and marking tree growth. But even she paused when she reached the back door. There, just beyond the porch, standing beneath a sycamore, was a tall shadow. Not threatening, just present. He didn't step closer. He didn't move. But he bowed. Not a full bend, just the head, down, then up. A slow acknowledgement. Then the shadow stepped back into the trees. Maris whispered something, barely breath. "He's still here." They spent the rest of the day moving slow, measuring the silences, listening more than talking. Wyatt noticed her fingertips brush against the wood of the door frame as she left, like she was asking the house for permission. Iris snapped a photo of the symbol etched faintly on the porch rail. Then they loaded back into the truck. As the sky turned gold behind the trees, Wyatt sat in the driver's seat longer than needed. Maris stared at the knot of leather again, thumbing it like prayer beads. Iris looked out the window toward the tree line. Something had shifted. The silence wasn't empty anymore. Later that night, back in town, Wyatt couldn't sleep. He walked the edge of his pasture, the stars blinking above in cold silence. When he reached the barn, he stopped. The pecan shells were back, not scattered, not random, lined across the windowsill. 3 in a row, waiting. And that same night, outside the hospital window, a tall shape moved just beyond the glass, slow and quiet. It didn't linger. It just paused, enough to be seen if someone were looking, then faded into the dark. Something was trying to speak, but it was doing it the only way it knew how. And Wyatt Boone, who never trusted signs, found himself watching the woods longer each night, wondering who was leaving them, wondering if maybe, just maybe, they weren't alone out there after all. The creek had thinned to a trickle. What used to be a wide, rushing stretch of water that cooled the valley in high summer had now pulled back, revealing its stone bones and secrets long forgotten. Down in the flats near Kiamichi's Bend, the riverbed lay exposed, pale, cracked, and littered with broken mussel shells that shimmered faintly in the mid-autumn sun. They weren't scattered. They were arranged, laid out in a line too neat to be natural. One after another, they led from the edge of the rock shelf toward a knotted sycamore at the bend. Wyatt stopped just short of the last step, his boots grinding in the silt. He didn't need to say anything. Maris was already beside him, her eyes scanning the shells, the way they curved like a thread being pulled toward something buried. They followed them in silence. Beneath the sycamore's roots, tucked into the hollow just above the flood line, was a scrap of oil-stained paper wrapped in waxed twine. The knot holding it together wasn't store-bought. It was handmade, with the same looping tension as the leather twist from the homestead. Maris unwrapped it slowly. The paper smelled of old bark and creek water. In the fading ink were just a few words, uneven, rushed, scrawled across the middle of the page. Don't trust what they say about Graham. Below it, not a name, just the Bellamy knot, drawn dark and tight. Her hands didn't shake this time. She just folded it back and slid it into the inside pocket of her coat. Iris crouched near the tree, tracing the way the roots coiled into the rock like ribs. "This was placed," she murmured. "It hasn't washed here. It was tucked." They stood together a while longer, letting the afternoon breathe around them, the sounds of the woods folding back in as if nothing had happened. But something had. Back at the homestead, they worked slower than usual. Maris had started clearing the kitchen shelves while Wyatt and Iris focused on the back bedroom. Dust hung heavy in the air, catching light like ash. The farther in they went, the more the air seemed to shift. Not heavy, exactly, just aware. Like the walls were listening. Wyatt pulled an old bureau from the corner, revealing another sliver of scorched floorboard. Blackened, but controlled. Someone had put out the fire before it spread. The edges were marked, almost like a box had been set there. He crouched low, scraping gently with the back of a trowel. Burn patterns didn't match accident. They matched caution. Later that day, when they gathered back on the porch to compare notes, a small voice called from the path. Cleo Hart, 11 years old, barefoot as usual, with a tin lunchbox swinging from her arm, stood at the edge of the clearing like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to approach. Her mother had warned her not to get in the way, but curiosity always had a stronger pull than rules. "Miss Maris?" she called. "I drew something." The girl walked up, pulled a folded sheet from her lunchbox, and held it out with both hands. It was notebook paper, rough edges, graphite lines dark and certain. A tall shape crouched near a creek wall, one long arm touching the ground, the other resting against its chest. Beside it stood a much smaller form, legs bowed slightly, as if copying the movement. Cleo pointed at the drawing. "I saw it by the rocks," she said. "Behind our place, 2 nights ago. It looked like it was talking without words." Maris knelt beside her, studying the gesture. "It did this?" she asked. Cleo nodded. "Real slow, like a bow, like saying hello without saying it." Wyatt took the paper, comparing it to the symbols they'd found. The proportions in the drawing were off, but the scale wasn't. Whatever the girl had seen, it stood at least 8 feet tall. Iris's voice broke the hush. "I've seen that before, in a book on indigenous forest gestures. That hand-to-chest motion, it means peace or recognition, but it predates most local tribes. It's ancient." They didn't say much else after that. The wind had picked up, and somewhere off in the trees, a branch broke with a sharp snap. Wyatt turned his eyes to the woods, hand resting on the rail, and thought about the leather knot again, the way the shells had lined up like signposts. None of it felt random anymore. That night, with the wind colder than expected, Maris placed a small plate of cornbread on the edge of the porch. Just one slice, still warm from the oven, wrapped in a cloth. No note, no explanation. She didn't tell the others, just left it there and went inside. The light stayed on until nearly midnight. In the morning, the bread was untouched, still folded, still warm from the sun now. But beside it, placed gently, almost ceremonially, was a sprig of wild sumac berries and a single red cedar leaf, fresh, damp with dew. Neither grew near the house. Wyatt saw it first, stepping out to feed the goats. He didn't touch it, he just stared. Something about the placement felt polite, like a trade, or an answer. He called Iris over, and she brought her camera, snapped 3 shots, then paused. "I don't think we should move it," she said. Maris joined them last. She didn't say a word, but her hand went instinctively to her pocket again. The leather knot. Always the same movement. Later that week, Buckland Reese came back. He didn't knock. Just walked into the clearing like he owned it. His eyes flicked to the porch, the sumac, the leaf. Then, to Maris. His face was unreadable, but something tightened in his jaw. "You've been digging," he said. Maris didn't answer. Wyatt stepped forward instead. "You said you didn't want trouble," Wyatt said calmly. "Neither do we." Buckland looked past them, toward the woods. "Trouble don't always look like you think it will," he muttered. "Sometimes it just watches. Quiet, waiting to see what you'll do." Then he walked around the side of the house like he was inspecting something. Wyatt followed, keeping a distance. Buckland stopped near the rear shed, tapped the wood with his knuckles. "There's things out here," he said over his shoulder. "Old things that remember more than you do. You should be careful what you wake up." He didn't wait for a response. Just kept walking, vanishing into the same tree line he'd come from. That night, Maris sat with the letters again. She had them spread across the table, sorted by year, by tone, by how frayed the edges were. One caught her attention, different paper, different ink. A journal entry, maybe. Her father's words were careful, almost hesitant. He'd written about a night during the fire when he'd fallen behind. A figure, tall, shadowed, had stepped out of the smoke, picked him up, and carried him through the ash without saying a word. He'd never told anyone. He feared they'd call him mad, but he'd never doubted what he saw. Wyatt read it with her, tracing each line slowly. The description was too clear to ignore. The size, the silence, the eyes that reflected light, not fear. "Same kind of creature Cleo drew," he said quietly. Maris looked out the window then, toward the trees, toward the dark space between the trunks. "They're watching," she whispered. "But not to hurt, to see if we remember." Wyatt didn't respond, but the weight in the air said he believed her. That night, just after 1 a.m., the Boone farm animals stirred. Nothing loud, just a shift in posture, an unease. The goats pressed close to the barn walls. The chickens stopped clucking mid-roost. Wyatt woke fast, boots on before his eyes adjusted. The barn door was unlatched. Outside, the mud held 2 sets of prints. One large, deep, spread wide. The other, smaller, lighter, overlapping the first in places, walking inside the shadow of the bigger. Almost like training. He didn't call out. He just stood in the chill, listening to the wind thread through the trees. Something had passed through, and it had done so gently. The animals settled minutes later. Nothing taken, nothing hurt, just observed. And just before sunrise, Wyatt stepped back onto the porch, staring down at the edge of the step. Another shell was there. This time, not a pecan, a mussel, river-worn, placed beside the wild sumac. A line was forming, and whoever was drawing it wanted to be understood. The cold had settled deep into the wood by early December, the kind of cold that stiffens hinges and makes the boards in the barn walls exhale with groans. The last of the fall leaves had long since been torn down by the wind, scattered across the pasture in brittle piles. The air was clear but unforgiving, sharp enough to sting your throat. That night, Wyatt Boone had been fixing the latch on the feed bin when he heard it. The sound that didn't belong. Not an animal, not wind, not something clumsy, just breathing, heavy, close. He stood still. Hand paused mid-turn, heart tightening. The hair along his arms lifted even before he turned his head. The stall wall behind him was made of rough pine slats, warped slightly with age, and between 2 of them, A sliver of moonlight fell across something watching him. Not eyes full of malice, not fear, just watching. He turned slowly and stepped toward the gate, easing it open. The air seemed to hold its breath with him. The moon had shifted behind a cloud, but the shape was there. Taller than the door frame, thick-limbed, still. Its eyes caught what little light there was, deep brown with flecks of gold, and they didn't flinch when he stepped forward. They softened. Wyatt didn't raise his voice, didn't speak at all. He only noticed what was in its hands, held out in front of the figure, balanced with the kind of care you don't expect from anything that size, was the same leather knot he'd picked up weeks ago at the Bellamy place. Not a copy. The same one. Polished now. Its lines neater, tighter, as if it had been rewrapped by something with patience and memory. He reached out, not touching, just letting the gesture linger. The figure lowered its arms, placed the knot on the split rail fence, and backed into the trees. It didn't run. It didn't fade. It walked back with purpose, head bowed in the same slow nod that Cleo had drawn, that Maris had recognized, that Iris had named. Recognition, greeting, peace. The next morning, Wyatt told no one. Instead, he drove out to the Bellamy homestead just as the frost was burning off the grass, a quiet stillness following him up the rutted road. Maris was already outside, sitting on the edge of the porch with a pad of paper in her lap, pencil unmoving. She looked up, and she didn't need to ask. He held out the knot. She reached for it slowly, like it was alive. "I don't think it ever left," he said. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers traced the folds in the leather, the way the pattern seemed to carry memory in every loop. Then she looked out at the trees again. "I think it remembers more than we do." They went back inside, the sun slanting through broken panes, casting lines across the dust. They were starting to know which floorboards to avoid, which windows held a draft. It was still a ruin, but less of one each day. The back pantry had been cleared, the hearth scraped clean. Iris had drawn up plans for a wood stove pipe install that wouldn't compromise the original structure. She worked quietly at the table while Maris unfolded the family embroidery patterns Graham had once tucked into an old ledger. The Bellamy knot wasn't just a design. It was a legacy, a family symbol passed down through hands that mended, that tied bundles, that kept records in cloth as much as on paper. The style of the twist matched one she found stitched into a faded handkerchief, thread barely holding, but still speaking. It wasn't just an emblem. It was a name. Leland Thatch arrived that afternoon. Radio crackling on his dashboard, old coffee steaming on the passenger seat. He carried with him a box of old maps, survey lines from the 1940s, and 2 flares he never liked to travel without. But that wasn't what he came to talk about. Not really. He waited until Maris stepped away before speaking to Wyatt. His voice was low, like he was afraid the trees might hear. "You ever hear the story of the fire in 46? He asked. Wyatt nodded. "Parts." Leland scratched at the back of his neck, as if the memory itched there. "I was just a boy. 7, maybe 8. My uncle was helping with the fire breaks. I remember watching from the hill, the way the smoke rolled like ocean tides. They said the wind shifted, came hard down the ridge. Caught them mid-cut, but some of them came back, not all." He paused, looked out the window. "My uncle said he saw a trail marked in the ash, arrows made from the black itself, leading out, like something had walked ahead of him, sweeping clear the path." Wyatt didn't respond. He didn't need to. Folks said he was full of it, said he'd inhaled too much smoke, but he never changed the story. Said something had shown him the way out, a figure tall enough to blot the sun, but it didn't talk. It just turned, looked at him, and moved on. Wyatt exhaled slowly. "That wasn't fire he was talking about," Leland added. "That was something else." By the time Leland drove off, the sun had started to drop again. A long winter sunset, gold bleeding into frost. Wyatt sat on the porch steps, knees aching in the cold, staring out at the same stretch of woods. Maris sat beside him, wrapped in an old quilt. She held the knot now like it belonged there. "This land doesn't need protecting from what's out there," she said. "It's what's out there that's been protecting us." Wyatt didn't say anything. Not then. That night in the cabin she slept in, her old bedroom now reclaimed from mildew and broken glass, Maris opened a new journal and wrote in ink that bled slightly on the page. "We are not searching the woods. The woods are answering. Outside, under the moon, the barn swayed gently in the wind. Somewhere past the creek, a soft thump sounded, more like a greeting than a threat. And somewhere far off, beyond what any eye could track, something tall moved through the trees. Not hiding, just passing." The next morning, Buckland Reese showed up again. He didn't come empty-handed. This time, he had a rolled blueprint in a plastic tube and a bag of old nails rattling in his grip. He didn't speak for the first few minutes, just looked at the house. Then at the knot Maris still wore at her hip. Then back to Wyatt. "I want to buy it," he said. Wyatt didn't move. Maris stepped forward. "You can't. It ain't safe," Buckland muttered. "Things here go quiet too long. Folks get ideas. I could tear this place down and bury the foundation by spring." "Why do you want to?" Wyatt asked, voice even. Buckland didn't answer directly. "I was paid once," he said slowly. "Long time ago. They asked me to clean out the house, after Graham disappeared. Told me to make sure nothing got left behind." He shifted the blueprint under his arm. "There were letters," he continued. "Drawers full, all addressed to Maris Bellamy. Never mailed. I burned some, took the rest, traded them for silence. I thought I was doing what was asked, not what was right." He didn't wait for forgiveness. He dropped the bag of nails on the porch and turned away. Maris didn't follow. She just watched him go, the paper knot tight in her palm, the wind stirring her hair across her eyes. That afternoon, clouds rolled low across the valley. Mist curled in the gullies and frost clung to the porch railings. But when Wyatt stepped outside just before dusk, he saw it. Lined on the edge of the stone steps at the base of the porch were two perfect rows of pecan shells. Clean, neat, facing each other. Between them, the leather knot had been placed again, this time polished, dusted, and left like a gift. "Not left behind," presented. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. Something had witnessed what was said, what was returned, what was admitted, and it had responded, in the quiet, with respect. The night came fast, and the clouds held the light down low. Somewhere deep in the trees, a low hum sounded. Not mechanical, not human, just breath, old and slow. And in the silence that followed, the kind that makes the hair behind your neck rise even though nothing moves, the weight of being watched didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like being remembered, under the weight of the first light snow. The Bellamy homestead looked less like a ruin and more like a breath held. White powder settled into the grooves of the roof shingles, into the cracks of the porch steps, along the broken sill where Maris had been keeping her father's letters. The world outside had gone quiet, as if trying to listen. And that morning, when the air still tasted like iron and wood smoke, she found the bundle, wrapped in waxed cloth and tucked beneath the leg of an old table that had nearly rotted through. She hadn't been looking. She'd just moved a box to sweep beneath it, and something had shifted with a soft thud. The moment her fingers touched the oilcloth, she knew. The letters weren't new. The paper was brittle at the corners, the ink faded in spots, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Graham Bellamy, her father. These were letters he'd written but never sent. And as she sat cross-legged on the floor beside the hearth, the snow melting on her coat, she opened one and began to read. I saw them again, one small, one large. They didn't speak, but they meant no harm. The younger one walked ahead, but when it grew nervous, it turned back. The mother stayed behind, watching, always watching. I'm beginning to believe they're not just watching me. They're watching the forest, as if it belongs to them in ways we've never understood. She read every word, lips barely moving, hands trembling just once when she reached the third letter. That one was different. He wrote about the day the tree came down, a storm-blown pine in the upper stretch of the west slope. He'd been trapped underneath. Broken ribs, twisted leg. He would have died if he hadn't heard the breath. Not a growl, not a call. Breath, and then hands, larger than any human's, sure but gentle, lifting him like a child. He said he remembered seeing the eyes first. Amber, alive. Then the shape of a child beside her, tall for its size, covered in damp fur, and strangely patient. It watched her as she carried him up the incline, then helped tuck pine needles around his shoulders for warmth. It waited there beside him until dawn. Maris closed the letter, laid it over her chest, and leaned back against the wall. The fire hadn't been lit yet. Her breath fogged in the air like it used to when she was a child, visiting her grandfather in cold Missouri mornings. But the warmth wasn't in the hearth. It was in the knowing. That what she believed wasn't just fantasy. That her father had seen them too. And he hadn't been afraid. Outside, Iris circled the perimeter, measuring tracks left in the snow. They weren't obvious. 2 sets, one small, light, skimming the surface of the frost, like the walker understood how to displace weight without leaving much behind. The other, wider, deeper, a stride longer than any man's. They didn't lead in a straight line. They curved, circled, paused near the chicken coop, then doubled back around to the side porch. No signs of aggression, just observation, just study. She knelt near the impression and reached out. It wasn't melted. It hadn't been made by something warm-blooded. Whatever had stepped there had done so long enough ago that the snow should have refrozen. But it hadn't. The outline still held, precise, like someone had preserved it, or guarded it. Wyatt came up behind her, silent until he crouched beside the lower branches. "You see the height difference?" she asked, brushing snow away from a second track. "Yeah, 2 of them." He nodded slowly, one following the other. "Not just following," she said. "Learning. Look at this step here. It's half the length of the larger one. Whoever left this wasn't being dragged. They were being taught." He didn't say anything right away, just kept scanning the tree line, eyes narrowing. Inside the barn later that afternoon, Wyatt found something else. Near the low-hanging beams where the goats sometimes scratched their backs, there was a smear. Not blood, not sap. Just a wide, faint mark across the lower trunk of a cedar post. He rubbed it with his glove and felt the indent. A palm, open and deliberate, pressed flat against the wood. Too high for a child, too low for a full-grown adult. It was placed at shoulder height for something kneeling, and just beside it, a second mark, smaller, matching. He stared at it for a long while, until the goats bleated softly behind him. Then he backed away, locked the barn door, and didn't tell anyone right away. That night, Cleo returned with another drawing. She'd stopped by on her way back from the winter feed station with her mom, her hands pink from cold, breath coming fast from running the last 100 yards. She held it out to Maris like she was handing over a message from the woods themselves. 2 figures again, one tall, standing still, one shorter, crouched beside a porch railing. In the middle, a human shape holding paper in hand, not clear, not fully drawn, just enough to tell the posture. Curious, unafraid, Maris smoothed the paper and asked gently, "Did you see them again?" Cleo nodded. "They were watching you read." That night, Maris placed the letters back in their oilcloth, tied them tight, and left them on the porch beside a stack of cornbread wrapped in wax paper. No offering, no bribe, just a gesture. In the morning, the cornbread remained untouched, but beside it sat a small, hollowed pine cone filled with bright winter berries and a single braid of cedar bark. Freshly knotted, Wyatt stared at it from the porch rail. "They're communicating." Maris stood beside him, arms crossed, breath clouding up in front of her. "Not just communicating," she said. They're watching what we do with the truth. The wind kicked up just then, a sharp gust that pulled dried leaves across the ground and rattled the shutters. He turned to go inside. That was when he noticed the mailbox. There was something inside. He opened it slowly. No postmark, no envelope. Just a torn piece of brown paper, written in uneven block letters, ink smudged, but the words legible. "Stop digging, or trouble will find you." He folded the note, slid it into his back pocket, and turned around. The trees were still. Nothing moved. No footprints in the snow. No sign of who had come or gone. Just that single warning. Maris didn't ask what he'd found, but she saw it in his face. "Whatever's hiding," she said softly. "It's not them." Wyatt nodded once. That night, when the house was quiet and the wind had calmed, he stepped out onto the porch one last time. The moon sat low behind a drift of gray clouds. No stars, just stillness. He walked to the barn, flashlight in hand, but didn't turn it on. His boots crunched in the frost. When he reached the fence line, he paused, listened. There was movement just beyond the clearing. Not crashing, not fast, just movement, steady, purposeful. Then a pause. He didn't move. Neither did they. Somewhere in the dark, something shifted behind a cedar. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. Watching, waiting. And for the first time since this all began, he lifted his hand. Not in warning, not to threaten. He placed his palm over his chest. A heartbeat passed, then another. And in the dark, he heard a sound, one deep soft exhale. And then silence again. Under the weight of a pale spring sky, the land looked quieter than it had in months. Not still, but waiting. The last of the frost had bled back into the dirt. The trees along the ridge were budding green tips like small promises. It was the kind of morning that carried a kind of hush, like something had just been said, and the world was holding its breath before answering. Wyatt stood in the field beside the cabin, hands resting on the top rail of the rebuilt gate, eyes following the sun as it warmed its way up past the east slope. He wasn't thinking about fences or weather. He was thinking about what came next, what to do with a place like this, now that it was no longer just haunted, now that it had spoken. Behind him, Maris knelt in the soil beside the porch, her palms dirt-blackened as she cleared space for new roots. She'd been up before daylight, dragging out old boards, shoveling through the thaw. She worked without looking up, without speaking much. But her breath moved in a steady rhythm, the way someone breathes when they've stopped bracing for grief. She'd named it already, Bellamy Haven. She'd said it softly one night by the fire, not asking for agreement, just placing the name gently into the air, like a stone returned to its rightful shelf. The others didn't argue. It fit. Iris was charting tree growth now, tracing old trails on the new map she'd pinned to the wall in the main room. Her request to the forestry board had been clear and bold. Reclassify the homestead and the surrounding acres. Not just private. Not for development, but for memory. For reverence. A place that would remain as it was. No cabins for rent. No guided tours. Just haven. Cleo had drawn the new sign weeks before, etching the letters into pine plank with a pocket knife older than she was. She came by after school with her mother, balancing a sack of wildflower seed and 2 nails. Leland showed up with an old oil lamp that once sat in the general store back when the town was still young. He cleaned the soot off it with a handkerchief, then handed it to Maris without saying anything. That morning, Wyatt helped her hang the sign. They chose the crossbeam just before the first bend in the path, a place that could be seen from the ridge and the road below. Bellamy Haven. The letters weren't perfect, but the feeling behind them was. They stood back, shoulder to shoulder, the sun behind them now, casting long shadows across the gravel. It should have been a moment of stillness. But something was wrong. The signpost had been split down the center, not with age, with force, clean, deliberate. The break started at the top and ran down like lightning had cracked the grain. Wyatt stepped closer, fingers tracing the damage. Then he saw them. Tracks. Heavy. Human-shaped. But wrong. Not the quiet placement they'd come to know, not the careful gestures or soft offerings left at night. These prints were crude, deep, angry, and beside them, a second set. Work boots. Familiar. He didn't say anything, just turned toward the path. Buckland Reese was already coming into view. The man's coat was mud-streaked, his jaw clenched. In his right hand, a crowbar. The same one Wyatt kept in the back of his own truck. Buckland didn't raise his voice. "You think this is safe?" he said, eyes fixed on Maris. "You think any of this is safe? You don't know what you're waking up." Wyatt stepped forward, placing himself between them. "We're not waking anything," he said. "We're remembering what was never gone." Buckland shook his head, spitting into the dirt. He reached into the canvas satchel on his hip and pulled something out. A bundle of papers, torn at the edges, bound in old twine. "I found these in a locker I'd sealed up, back when they told me to clean it out. Said they didn't matter, said she'd never come back to read them." He dropped the bundle at Maris's feet. "Letters your father wrote. More of them." Maris didn't move. She stared at the papers like they were a trap, then bent slowly, picking them up with both hands. The twine fell loose. Inside, pages she hadn't seen. Apologies, maps, warnings. One sheet bore the Bellamy knot in ink darker than the rest. "I burned some," Buckland said, quieter now. "Didn't want to, but I did. They paid me. A man from town, one of the old council members. Said Graham was sick. Said if I didn't remove every trace of his presence, folks would ask questions." "Who?" Wyatt asked. Buckland shrugged. "He's dead now, and maybe I'm trying to clear what's left of my name, or maybe I'm just tired." He turned, walking back down the hill without waiting for forgiveness. They didn't speak for a long time. The sign still hung from one good side of the beam. Wyatt fetched the oil lamp from the porch, hung it beside the split wood. It swayed gently, glinting in the morning light. Maris laid the letters across the porch steps, weighting the corners with smooth creek stones. By afternoon, the wind had shifted again. Softer now, wet with spring. Cleo returned near dusk, pointing toward the ridge. "Something's up there," she said. "I saw shapes, not just one." They climbed the trail before the sun dipped too far. Wyatt led, shotgun strapped but unloaded. Iris brought binoculars. The trail wound tight near the top, passing through a split of stones that framed the valley below like a window. And there, on the high ridge where the trees bent low in the wind, they saw it. A line of shells, 2 rows, pecan on one side, river mussel on the other. In the center, set atop a flat piece of slate, was the leather knot. Cleaned, polished, restitched. Beside it, a twig bundle tied with cedar bark and a single braid of wild grass. An answer. A gesture. Not forgiveness. Recognition. They didn't touch it. They left it as it was. And as they turned back, heading down the trail with the dusk on their backs and the scent of pine rising from the warming soil, Wyatt paused once. The air had changed. Not colder, not threatening, just different. And off in the distance, too far for shape but close enough for meaning, a low sound carried through the trees. A sound like breath, or thanks, or memory. And in the valley below, the lamp at Haven flickered once, then glowed steady. The wind came first, dry and wild, curling down off the ridges like something was chasing it. Then came the smell. Smoke, sharp and sudden, threading between the trees before anyone saw a flame. By the time Wyatt looked up from the south fence line, the sky had already turned. Pale blue smothered into brown, then orange. A line of fire moved across the hill behind the old rail yard, thin at first, then wider, licking fast through the scrub that hadn't been cleared in decades. The kind of fire that didn't ask permission, the kind that had memory. He didn't need a radio. He didn't need a map. He knew exactly where it was going. Straight for Haven. He ran. The smoke was low and fast. pushing ahead of the flames like a warning. By the time he reached the cabin, Maris had already thrown open the side hatch and was hauling buckets from the rain barrels. Iris was barefoot, a scarf tied tight across her face, digging a line into the dry grass with a Pulaski, sweat already cutting through the soot on her forehead. Cleo's mother was at the bottom of the trail waving cars back, her flashlight stuttering in the rising wind. Leland's truck fishtailed into the clearing 5 minutes later, the water tank strapped to the back rattling like a rib cage. He didn't speak when he jumped down, just handed Wyatt a fire rake and kicked the pump into gear. Everyone moved like they'd done this before. Because they had. The last time a fire came this close, it had swallowed the western ridge. Graham Bellamy hadn't made it out. This time would be different. The sky turned copper, the air howled. Iris shouted something, but the wind stole it before it reached anyone. They saw her pointing, and Wyatt turned. The fire had split. One tongue moving east toward the deer path. One south, straight toward the lower pasture, straight toward the old gate and the barn beyond. And standing in the middle of it, limp and panicked, tangled in the edge of the wire fence, was a small figure. At first, Wyatt thought it was a fawn, but the shape was wrong. Arms, not legs. He was running before the thought finished forming. His knee gave once in the mud, screaming up into his ribs. But he didn't stop. The smoke was everywhere now, a second sky pressing low against the dirt. His boots slid through ash and gravel, and something in his chest told him he was too late. But then he saw it, closer now, clearer. A young one, covered in soot, fur-matted, caught halfway in the break between the barbed fence posts. Its arm was twisted beneath it, and it thrashed once, letting out a low, desperate sound that didn't belong in any known language. But Wyatt understood it all the same. He reached for the wire. His gloves were gone. He pulled anyway. The barb tore into his palms, slicked his fingers red. He didn't care. He pulled until the wire snapped. The young one scrambled forward, tripped, and collapsed. That's when the heat hit him. A wave, not a flicker, a wall. He stumbled. His knee buckled. The ground twisted, then gave. He hit the dirt on his side. Breath ripped from him. His back burned from the heat, and he knew, clear as anything, that he wasn't going to get back up. Then something moved behind him, fast. No footsteps, just presence. A shadow swept the smoke aside. Huge. He felt it before he saw it. A hand gripped under his shoulder and pulled him, hard, through the ash. The motion wasn't rough. It was urgent, precise, and behind him, another hand, smaller, curled around the young one's back and helped it rise. Together they moved. The wind changed. The fire shifted. And suddenly, they were through. The clearing was behind them. Haven was ahead. Wyatt collapsed at the edge of the irrigation ditch, coughing until he saw stars. Maris ran to him, dropping beside him in the mud. Her hands moved over his chest, his arms. He waved her off, eyes wide, trying to speak. "They helped me," he gasped. She looked up, but they were gone. Only smoke. Then Iris shouted again. This time everyone heard. The fire line had stopped. Not by chance. The dirt had been churned in wide arcs across the lower slope. Not by plow. Not by boots. Hands. Large, broad, powerful. The fire had followed the wind, but the wind had shifted along a line. A path. Marked. Leland stared at the ground, wiping his brow. "That wasn't luck," he muttered. Cleo pointed toward the ridge, her voice small. "Look. Up there, against the red-black haze of the smoke and sky, a single figure stood. Tall, motionless, watching, and just beside it, smaller, closer. Both turned, and were gone. No one spoke, not yet. When morning came, the line of fire was declared controlled. No structures lost, no homes damaged. The townspeople called it a miracle. Wyatt didn't argue. He spent the next afternoon bandaging his palms while Maris walked the upper trail with Cleo. The girl didn't speak much. She didn't have to. Her latest drawing said more than words could. 2 figures standing over a burned field. One kneeling beside a third. hands outstretched. Recognition. Respect. That evening, Maris placed the picture in the window facing the ridge. Iris left a bundle of cedar at the foot of the porch. Wyatt placed a basin of water beside it. Leland added a shell. Nothing was said. Everything was understood. The next morning, the sign was still there, but nailed beneath it, 3 new items. A pecan shell, split clean, a piece of sumac, fresh, and a strip of leather, folded tight, with a knot even Maris hadn't seen before. Not one of Graham's. Something new. The wind moved low through the trees, and from far off, near where the fire had turned back, came the sound of breath. Not warning, not fear, just a reminder. Late summer arrived like a held breath finally let go. The wind shifted from dry to soft. The light across the field turned golden again, and the woods, those woods that had carried fear and fire and memory, stood calm and still as if watching. 1 year had passed since the blaze that never quite made it to Haven, since Wyatt Boone had been pulled from the ash by something most folks still didn't believe in. But the people who gathered now didn't need convincing. They'd seen enough. They'd lived inside the silence and come out with something louder than proof. That morning, folding chairs lined the edge of the porch, the kind that squeaked when you leaned back too far. Children ran between the trees, not afraid of what might be watching. A dog barked once and chased a grasshopper, and old Mr. Casey from the feed store tried to tune his fiddle but couldn't quite hear the pitch over the murmured voices. The gathering wasn't official. No press, no church bulletin, no schedule. But they came anyway. From the edge of Honobia, from the next town over, from places the Bellamy name still meant something. Most hadn't set foot on the property since the 90s. Some never had. But they came. Because stories do that, especially the ones that nearly vanished. Maris stood near the window with Cleo, helping her fold small paper cards with wildflower seeds glued inside. A gift for each guest. Cleo wore a dress too big for her. Sleeves rolled, shoes kicked off long ago. She didn't ask if they'd come. She just smiled each time a new pair of boots crunched the gravel. Iris arranged a stack of photographs on the table inside, copies of journal pages, pressed leaves, maps. On one corner, the oil lamp still burned low even in daylight. It had become something more than decor. A promise, maybe, or a way home. Wyatt leaned against the porch rail, his bad knee wrapped, cane resting against the wall. He hadn't said much all morning. He didn't have to. He watched instead. Watched the way Leland greeted every guest like an usher at a family reunion. Watched Maris place Graham's old compass in the center of the stone table beneath the cedar. Watched the faces shift from polite to silent as the weight of what this place had become slowly settled in their bones. Just before noon, the wind picked up. Not strong, but enough to rattle the pages of the guest book. Leland stepped up onto the porch, cleared his throat once, then pulled from his pocket a folded letter sealed in wax. He looked down at it like it still carried heat. "Wasn't mine to open," he said softly. "But Graham left it with me. Said to wait until she was ready." He turned to Maris. She nodded once. He cracked the seal. The crowd hushed. His voice shook on the first word, but found rhythm by the second. "If this letter's being read, it means you've come home. Maybe not to me, maybe not to the man I was, but to the place that still remembers us both. I never had the courage to leave things right, but I had the faith they might find their way anyway. I saw something once in those woods, something ancient and kind. It didn't ask for anything, just watched, just protected. And I learned that being a neighbor doesn't mean fences. It means memory. It means leaving room for something older than us to share the land. If you can hear this, Maris, it means you've made Haven into more than a name. You've made it into something worth coming back to." He folded the letter, looked out toward the tree line, said nothing else. No one clapped. No one needed to. The crowd slowly spread into the yard, quiet conversations beginning like streams returning to their beds after flood. Cleo darted between them with her seed packets. Wyatt sat near the porch and let the sun warm the edge of his boot. Then Buckland appeared. He hadn't been seen in weeks. Most thought he'd skipped town after what happened. But he walked straight down the path, hair longer, eyes clearer. He didn't look at anyone at first. Just made his way to the cedar table and laid something beside the compass. A wooden box, old, heavy, and full of items no one else could have known had existed. Photographs, receipts, folded blueprints of the old sawmill, a bag of letters yellowed by smoke. He turned to the crowd. "I lied," he said. "For a long time, took money I didn't need, burned what I was told to, and I lived quiet because I thought I had to. But this place, it never forgot, and neither did they." He looked toward the trees, then stepped back, hands loose at his sides, waiting. A deputy came forward, not in cuffs, not in force, but with a clipboard. Buckland signed without a word, then nodded to Maris, who hadn't moved since he approached. "Tell them I said sorry," he whispered. "Even if they don't speak like we do." He left with the deputy. The guests filtered back toward the food table, uneasy at first. But as the afternoon stretched long, so did the comfort. Laughter returned. Children chased shadows that no longer felt strange. Just before dusk, Cleo tugged at Wyatt's sleeve and pointed toward the lower ridge. "Can we show them now?" Maris joined them. Iris too. The path had been cleared just enough, wide enough for walking, not vehicles. Wildflowers were already reclaiming the sides. And at the end of the trail, near a moss-covered boulder that looked like it had held the same spot for 100 years, were 3 objects laid side by side: a split pecan shell, cleaned, a river mussel, still damp, and a length of soft leather knotted at the center, looped twice, then twisted into a closed ring. No note, no sign, just placement. Wyatt didn't speak. He knelt slowly, touched the ground in front of the stones, and stood. Behind them, the guests fell quiet. Some bowed their heads, others just listened, because the forest had gone silent again, but not in warning, in reverence. As the sun dipped low and bathed the trees in soft amber light, something moved near the edge of the clearing. Not loud, not hidden. 2 shapes, one tall, upright, unmoving. One shorter, stepping half a pace behind. They stood in the open, not coming closer, not walking away, just there, watching. And when Maris raised her hand, not a wave, but a gesture of recognition, the tall figure lowered its head, just once. The smaller did the same, then they turned, and were gone. No branches snapped, no birds flew, just the soft settling of twilight. Wyatt stepped back, his hand resting on the wooden post that held the Haven's sign. The wind moved through the grass like breath. Cleo spoke first. They said goodbye. Maris smiled without speaking. Because maybe that wasn't goodbye at all. Maybe it was the kind of farewell you give to someone you expect to see again. And as night came on, the last rays of sun touching the edge of the ridge, the wooden sign above them swayed slightly in the breeze. Bellamy Haven, still standing, still watching, still remembered. And beneath it, faint but certain, the sound of footsteps moving away. Heavy, gentle, but never gone. Sometimes the world doesn't speak in words. It speaks in silence, in footprints left behind in the mud, in gestures passed from one hand to another, in the echo of breath through trees older than memory. And when we slow down long enough, when we listen not just with our ears but with our hearts, we begin to understand that not all stories are meant to be explained. Some are meant to be honored. There are places where the lines between seen and unseen are thinner than bark, where the earth keeps its own record, not on paper but in moss, wind, and the hush between birdsong. Places that remember who we were long after we forget ourselves. And in those places, if we are quiet, we may find that we are not as alone as we thought. That maybe, just maybe, something older, kinder, and wilder than us has been watching. Not out of fear, but out of trust. This story was never about proof. It was never about fear or spectacle or answers wrapped in finality. It was about the quiet miracle of being seen, of being forgiven by something that owes us nothing. It was about the chance to begin again, not because we deserve it, but because the land itself is willing to hold space for those who return with open hands. It reminds us that compassion doesn't always come dressed in language, that family can take shapes we don't understand, that healing doesn't always arrive with a cure, but sometimes with a moment, brief, fleeting, where two very different worlds look at each other and simply choose not to run. The forest has always known how to keep secrets, but it also knows how to share them, carefully, through ritual, through rhythm, through trust earned in the quiet. And if we choose to live gently, if we walk with reverence and leave room for wonder, then perhaps the forest will continue whispering to us through the wind, the leaves, and the distant sound of something large, just beyond sight. Thank you for listening to this story. If it stirred something in you, if it made you feel less alone, or more curious, or simply more connected, we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let us know what this story meant to you, what you felt, or even what you remembered. And if these kinds of quiet, human stories rooted in mystery and grace speak to your soul, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and join us again next time. There are more footsteps in the woods, and more voices waiting to be heard. Until then, stay kind, stay curious, and stay close to the fire.